Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Bull Take Scouting Podcast. Since the last time we were on air, the whole NFL draft unwinded, and we've been taking the last, almost 2 weeks to just digest everything that's happened, look at every team's draft classes as a whole, because you don't want to just look at each pick in a vacuum. And today we're going to be rolling through the NFC, each of these draft classes, just giving our, quick hitter thoughts.
Yeah, so I think we can start off right away. We'll go somewhat in draft order, but we'll go by division. So we'll start off with the NFC South. The Panthers, who had the first overall pick, they took obviously Bryce Young, number one, and then some of the other notable picks. Jonathan Mingo, the wide receiver, in round two. DJ Johnson, the edge from Oregon, in round three. Chandler Zavala, the guard from NC State, in round four, and Jamie Robinson, the safety from Florida State, in round five. Really quick about the Panthers, I felt like they had a really solid draft overall. They needed to move up for a quarterback. They got the guy that I would consider the QB1 in the draft. You would consider the QB1 in the draft. I think they made the right decision to move up. I don't feel like they gave up a ton of assets. They gave up next year's first and DJ Moore, but it doesn't really, hurt them far out into the future like some of the other trade ups we've seen in the past. I really like the Mingo pick as well in round two, and the Robinson pick in round five to me also stood out as a good value pick there.
Yeah, I think this draft is just going to be remembered as the one where they went up and got their guy who I think Bryce Young's going to be their franchise quarterback. He's going to be playing that position for them for the next 15 years. So that's automatically a really good draft. Other than that, I like the Mingo pick too, and I think they needed to give him an extra weapon after shipping away DJ Moore to be able to get him in the first place. And I did really like the Chandler Zavala pick in round four. Were it not for an extensive injury history, I think we'd be seeing him potentially in the second round. If he can stay healthy, I think he's an NFL starter all day. And moving on to the Atlanta Falcons, well, they opened the draft, and what we've seen them do the last few years is they don't really care about how you define positional value in this day and age. They took Kyle Pitts fourth overall a couple of years ago or last year, and this year they went with Bijan Robinson at eighth overall and followed that up with Matthew Bergeron in round two, Zach Harrison in round three, Clark Phillips in round four, and then DeMarco Hellams in round seven. And I like the Robinson pick, though I think that they could have gone with a player that at a position that was more of a weakness, like Peter Skoronski at guard or tackle or Christian Gonzalez at cornerback. So, you can't complain too much because I think he's going to be a really good player for them, but I would have gone in a slightly different direction. I think Bergeron was a little bit of a reach in the second round, but Harrison was a good pick in round three. And I think Clark Phillips was one of the very best picks in the entire draft. I think he's their starting nickel on day one, despite being a day three pick. And he could, have a few interceptions as a rookie. We saw he had really good ball skills at Utah.
Yeah, I think my only issue with the Robinson pick is I really wouldn't pick a running back high in the draft unless I was a team in contention when that running back could bring me over the top. And I don't think anyone would argue that the Falcons are in that position right now. So, yeah, he's going to be a great player for them. He's going to help, make their offense better than it would be without him. But I'm just a little bit, concerned about how much of an impact will he have in the win column the next few years. Will he help them win playoff games? Will they get to the playoffs? I'm not really sure, but overall still a really good player and a solid pick for them.
Yeah, I think the one thing there is that I agree with your point, but they do have a second-year quarterback that they're trying to turn into a franchise quarterback. So I think the one exception is if you're in that situation and adding a star running back would really help him ease into a starting NFL job, not being Desmond Ridder for the Falcons. So that makes me understand the pick a little more.
Yeah, you're right. That does make some sense. Moving on to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, the first round, they took Kalijah Cansey, the defensive tackle from Pittsburgh, Cody Mauch, the guard from North Dakota State, in round two, Yaya Diaby, the defensive end from Louisville, in round three. I don't know if I'm going to say this name correctly, but Servokia Dennis, the linebacker. Servasia Dennis, the linebacker from Pittsburgh, in round five, and then Payne Durham, the tight end from Purdue, also in round five. I think the Buccaneers kind of swung and missed with their first round pick in Kancey. I know they wanted to, add to that defensive line. They've been taking edge rushers for the past couple of years high in the draft, and it really hasn't worked out. And to me, I know a lot of people liked Kancey. I just feel like he's not a 3-down player.
Mm-hmm.
He can rush the passer, but I don't think he performed very well against the run. And to me, if you're taking a defensive lineman in the first round, they need to be on the field, all 3 downs, or be like extremely elite in one area. Like, for example, Jordan Davis last year, I didn't see him as a 3-down player all the time. But he was just so good at what he did that I did have a first round grade on him. But I think Kancey is in that, conversation. So that really felt like set the draft off on a poor note for the Buccaneers.
Yeah, I think Kansas shouldn't have been a first round pick. The one good thing about that pick is Vita Vea is probably the best D tackle that you could pair him with, given that he's such a big, imposing run stuffer who's going to command double teams, and that could free up a lot of one-on-one matchups and for Kansas to show off his pass rush ability. But overall, still not a pick that I can totally get on board with, and a pretty bare draft that I don't think is going to really prevent the Buccaneers from being one of the bottom third teams in the league this year. And moving on to the Saints, I really like the draft they had, honestly. They just made a solid pick with each of their selections. Brian Bresee in the first round, Isaiah Foskey in the second round, Kendre Miller in the third round. I'm not sure about that one as much as I am the others, because they have Alvin Kamara, and a running back who's going to start off as a backup in round 3 is not the best value, but and they kept going after that with solid picks. Nick Saldiveri, who I think has starter potential in the 4th round. Jake Hayner is probably going to be a solid backup, and then A.T. Perry in the 6th round was a real steal.
Yeah, I think Bresee was a great pick in round 1. He's got a great story, and hopefully he can kind of perform better in the NFL than he did on college. I know he had a lot of stuff going on in his personal life and injuries and illnesses, but I think he'd be a really solid addition to that defensive line. To provide maybe a little bit of clarity on the Miller pick, I think there's a looming concern about a potential Kamara suspension because of his incident a couple of years ago at the Pro Bowl. And I think Kamara's starting to, get old. He's been around for a while now as a running back. So I wouldn't, be shocked if they started to kind of ease Kamara out of it, especially if he ended up with a suspension sometime this year.
Yeah, that makes a good deal of sense. And moving to the NFC West now, we've got the Seattle Seahawks, who had an incredible first round. I mean, to get Devin Witherspoon at 5th and Jackson Smith-Njigba at 20th, those 2 guys are going to be day 1 starters. They're going to be really good players in the NFL. I can't really complain much. I have a slight preference for Christian Gonzalez over Witherspoon, but Witherspoon's a really good player too. And I love that, if you're going to pay Geno Smith, how about you go get him a wide receiver 3, so that now you don't just have Lockett and Metcalf on the outside. You're giving teams a real issue to worry about with Jackson Smith-Njigba in the slot. I really love that. I think their draft really fell off after that, though. I was not really impressed by their day 2 selections. Derek Hall was a bit of a reach. Zach Charbonnet is a good player, but man, you're going to pick a backup running back in the 2nd round. I like the idea of giving a compliment to Ken Walker. You don't want to wear him out too much. You want to keep him fresh so that, when he gets the ball, he's going to be able to provide the explosive plays that he's so good at. But you can do that in round 4, with a guy like Roshan Johnson, for example. I don't like that they went with that option that early. And then one more pick I want to highlight on day 3, Olu Oluwatimi, the center from Michigan, I think was a really good pick, and he could potentially be their starting center.
Yeah, the Seahawks were kind of mentioned as one of the teams looking for a center in the draft, and I think they were the team that ended up waiting on a center.
Yeah,
and I think Oluwatimi, like you mentioned, has a real chance to be a starter for them down the road. And yeah, I mean, I agree with the evaluation of the Charbonnet pick. They needed another running back, but I don't think round 2 was the spot to address it. Especially because there are other running backs, like you mentioned, Rashawn Johnson, that they could have just gotten later that would have offered a very similar skill set and just could have gotten better value in other places in round 2. Moving on to the Cardinals, who I think had a really, really good draft.
Yeah.
They started off at pick 3. traded down to 12 and then back up to 6. They netted an extra first round pick next year, which is the Texans' first round pick, so they could end up being pretty high. So that's, great for them. They got the same guy that they were planning on taking, or we think they were planning on taking in at 3 with Paris Johnson. And then the rest of their draft is really good as well. BJ Ojolari in round 2, Garrett Williams, the cornerback from Syracuse in round 3, Michael Wilson, the wide receiver from Stanford in the end of round 3, and then John Gaines, a guard from UCLA in round 4. I think Ojolari is a guy that could add to that pass rush. I know they're kind of lacking there. They lost Chandler Jones last year. J.J. Watt retired. And I think Ojolari could be a guy that could, start day one and put up, maybe 6 to 8 sacks his rookie year. And then I think the rest of the guys that they got throughout the draft, Williams, Wilson, and Gaines, I think they could all either be starters or really solid depth pieces for the Cardinals.
Yeah, I absolutely loved the draft that they had, especially the business that Monty Ossenfort, the first-year GM, was making. He was wheeling and dealing all weekend, and he added a first-round pick, as you said, the Texans, so that could be really high next year, and 2 third-rounders. And next year's draft is rumored to be better than this one, especially at the top. So to potentially have 2 top 10 picks in next year's draft is going to be really something. And, imagine a world in which the Cardinals and the Texans are the 2 worst teams in the league. The Cardinals have the top 2 picks. They can take Caleb Williams at number 1, the generational talent, and then they get a haul for Kyler Murray, and at the second pick, a haul for Drake May on top of the draft capital they've already accumulated. Now, that's just a scenario that I think is super interesting to think about, and I'll be watching their draft position and the Texans draft position really closely because of that. And just to get back to the players they picked this year, because despite the capital they accumulated, I still think that they made some nice picks. Paris Johnson is probably going to be their franchise left tackle. I think he's got a few things to improve on, but for his first year at left tackle, he looked pretty good to me, and I like the BJ Ojolari pick a lot. And then Williams and Wilson in the 3rd round are 2 guys who had some injuries, and I think that if they were healthier, they would have gone a lot higher. So those 2 guys have the potential to outplay their draft positions if they can stay healthy.
Yeah, and I think one thing to kind of think about with the Cardinals next year is how good does Kyler Murray have to, if they end up with the first overall pick, maybe it's the Texans' first overall pick, the Cardinals picks, maybe in the teens, maybe they end up making the playoffs. How good does Kyler Murray have to play in order to pass on Caleb Williams? Just something to think about, because if Murray, comes back and he's one of the top 10 quarterbacks in the NFL, you don't move on from that, do you? Because we all think Williams is going to be really good, but I feel like if you have a top 10 quarterback, you stick with it.
I don't think they can have a top 10 quarterback and end up with the first pick. The position is so important.
No, if it was the Texans.
Oh, the Texans is first pick.
Yeah.
Then that's an interesting question, because everything we're hearing, and I've yet to scout him formally, so I'm gonna hold back my opinion on this, but everything we're hearing is Caleb Williams is a generational talent, and whoever has the first pick is gonna pick him. That gets a little more interesting. You're right. If Kyler Murray did have a really good year and it's the Texans' pick, definitely would be an incredible storyline. I have a feeling that I once again have to get my own eyes on his film, but that they would just go for it. We'll see though, and it was definitely an interesting draft, and I like that they moved a lot of their capital into next year. Moving on to the Rams, this is a team that once again lacked a first rounder, as they have for many years now. But for once, I actually loved their draft. I think it's the most underrated draft class. They opened up with a really solid pick in Steve Avila. He's a day 1 solid starter, and then overall, I think you could look back at this draft and see like 4 or 5 starters 3 years from now, and maybe even earlier, because their roster is pretty depleted. They got Byron Young in round 3, Kobe Turner as well. On day 3, Nick Hampton, fantastic pick. Puka Nacua, another guy who, if he was healthier, would be going a lot earlier. I love Davis Allen in round 5. Travius Hodges-Tomlinson in round 6. We're talking about the Jim Thorpe Award winner, and yes, he's 5'8", but he's going to be a good starting nickel in the NFL. That was a great pick. Zach Evans, I think, is a solid backup running back in the NFL too. The one pick that is a little interesting to me is the Stetson Bennett pick. Man, I didn't think he was going that high. I really didn't think so. We heard he might go undrafted, and I struggle with picking Bennett over someone like Dorian Thompson Robinson, who I really loved. Someone like Aiden O'Connell as well. That was pretty surprising to me. So that's the one pick on day 3 where I'm not too sure about.
Yeah, I think like you mentioned with the Rams, despite not having a first round pick, they got a lot of quality players that could
Yeah.
end up being quality starters. And I think, it's kind of worth noting to anyone that's following us on Instagram as we're releasing our draft grades. We gave the Rams an A-, got a little bit of slack for that because they didn't have a top end talent. But our grades are based on what the teams did with the picks that they had. Um, would would their draft class overall be top 3, 4, 5? Probably not because they don't have that high end talent. But what they did with the picks that they came into the draft with was really, really solid. And like you mentioned, Avila, Young, Turner, Nick Hampton all have potential to be starters
Yeah.
for that team, and Hodges Tomlinson as well. So that's 5 potential starters. I think anytime you get that number of starters, could end up being A- draft. Moving on to the 49ers, another team that didn't have a first round pick or a second round pick for that matter. And, I just think they really kind of swung and missed in this draft quite a few times. Jair Brown, the safety from Penn State, was solid, but really after that, Jake Moody, the kicker from Michigan in the 3rd round, not really a fan of taking a kicker that early. Cameron Latu, the tight end from Alabama in round 3. Darrell Little Jr., the cornerback from South Alabama in round 5. And then Ronnie Bell, the wide receiver from Michigan in round 7. I don't really see potential starters there outside of Brown and, obviously a kicker. But I just feel like you get a kicker undrafted that ends up being a good starter for you.
Yeah.
So just really confusing draft all around. I thought Latu was a little bit of a reach, but really struggling with the 49ers draft.
Yeah, I was excited for their draft despite the lack of early round capital because if you look at the steals they've gotten in the middle rounds of the NFL draft, we're talking George Kittle, Talanoa Hufanga, Fred Warner, Dre Greenlaw. It's super impressive.
Brock
But
Purdy.
yeah, exactly. That's all the way up to Mr. Irrelevant. I just don't think that it's going to be the case again this year. Jair Brown, I think, is just a solid backup. My qualms with the Jake Moody pick is that I don't know how to scout kickers, and I don't think the NFL really does either. I mean, we saw Roberto Aguayo be one of the best college kickers ever, go in the 2nd round, and he couldn't make an NFL roster. Whereas undrafted kickers there's several of them that are starters. So just looking at the miss rate on early to mid round kickers and seeing how many are late round undrafted, it just doesn't make sense to take one that high, even if you're confident in his abilities. And then, yeah, I just don't really see a future starter with the rest of their picks, like you were saying. Moving on to the NFC East, the talk of the town were the Philadelphia Eagles, who really balled out in this draft. Howie Roseman does it again. At 9th, they've trade up one spot to get Jalen Carter. And, we don't know that Jalen Carter is going to work out. There are the off-field concerns that have been heavily media-sized, but Jalen Carter is a supreme talent, and he's going to a place with a good culture with several of his teammates there, including Nakobe Dean, who was the leader of that locker room and that defense at Georgia. I love that pick. And then, Nolan Smith, another Georgia defender who also, like Nakobe Dean, elite character and leadership. I don't know how he fell there, but he's going to be a really good player. And that pass rush got a lot scarier with those two. I don't like the Tyler Steen pick, but that's the only pick that I really didn't like. I love the Sidney Brown pick. We've been focusing on Carter and Smith. That picking Sidney Brown in the 3rd round is an incredible pick. I just mentioned Talanoa Hufanga for the 49ers. He reminds me a lot of Hufanga, and I think he could be a similar level player in the NFL. And then I was intrigued by the Keely Ringo pick because this is a guy who got like 1st round hype for a couple years, and I was just not on board with that. I see a really raw player who struggles to stick in man coverage, but in the 4th round, it's worth a shot. But that being said, they actually traded next year's 3rd rounder to get that 4th round pick to select him, which I thought was an interesting move. That means they really wanted to come up there and add Keely Ringo, so that was interesting.
They traded next year's 3rd to get a
Yeah.
4th round pick?
Yeah.
That's interesting. I didn't even realize that. But
Yeah.
I mean, even even so, taking Ringo with a end of the third round pick, which we'd assume they'd have next year, I still think that's solid value
Yeah, it is.
and worth a flyer. But I mean, Carter and Nolan Smith, I think those were two great picks, some of the best picks in the first round. Uh, yeah, yeah, I feel like I've said it before. I'm gonna say it again. To me, Carter had the best tape of the NFL draft. If he didn't have any off-field problems, he probably would have been my number one overall player. I just think he was that good, and he's going to be, assuming everything off the field works out. I see no reason as to why he wouldn't be dominant on that defensive line. And then Nolan Smith was one of my favorite guys in the draft. I just, for whatever reason, I just loved his tape, loved his pass rush ability. And again, along that defensive line, being able to rotate through, I think he's going to be really solid. And Sidney Brown was my safety one. So getting him in round 3 is, A plus right there for the Eagles. Moving on to, a not so good draft on the NFC East, the Washington Commanders, who in round 1 took Emmanuel Forbes over Christian Gonzalez. And that was really just not a great pick in my opinion. And then round 2, they did take Quan Martin, the safety from Illinois. I think that was a really solid pick. And then Ricky Stromberg in round 3, Braden Daniels, the guard from Utah in round 4, and then KJ Henry, defensive end from Clemson in round 5. So I mentioned about Forbes. To me, he wasn't really close to a first round talent. I had serious concerns about his size, and taking him, kind of in the middle of round 1 is just crazy to me, especially with Gonzalez on the board. And then, I mentioned Quan Martin. It was a really good pick, my safety 2, right behind Sidney Brown. I know he was your safety 1. I think he could. I would argue that he's going to outperform Forbes. I just think he's a better player, even though he's a safety and Forbes is a corner. Ricky Stromberg to me was a little bit of a reach, but I think it's looking like right now he's going to be their starting center. So if he does end up as their starter, getting a starter in round the end of round 3 is always a good pick.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I just didn't like the Emmanuel Forbes pick. I understand that he's a ball hawk, gets his hands on the football, but Christian Gonzalez is just so much more solid in man coverage. So is Deontay Banks. So is Joey Porter. I had a third round grade on Forbes, so that just really weighs down the rest of their draft. After that, I actually like their draft. Quan Martin is one of my favorite players in the draft. I love him. I think he's their starting nickel day 1, and he's going to be really good. And then Ricky Stromberg and Braden Daniels are 2 guys who I think could end up being starters. So it wasn't the worst draft in the world because they had a solid, day 2 and on, but I cannot get on board with the Forbes pick, as you said. And moving on to the New York Giants, I was really worried about the Giants draft heading in because they had 3 needs that were really desperate, and that's cornerback, center, and wide receiver. Like I haven't really remembered a draft where we knew the first 3 picks were going to be these 3 positions. Sometimes if a team's going to pick this position, or maybe the first 2 positions. I've never really been able to have such a good handle on these 3 positions are going to be selected by this team, and that's why I really like the Giants drafted, because they managed to address those 3 positions without making any reach. They let the board fall to them. The wide receivers the top few were gone in round 1 when they picked. They moved up 1 spot to get Deontay Banks, so I think is going to be real solid for them. In round 2, again, they didn't have a great wide receiver value, and the center board was going to thin out right after that. So they went with John Michael Schmitz, who I think was a good value there. And then I love the fit with Jalen Hyatt to the New York Giants. Hyatt's a guy who he's got fantastic speed and ball tracking ability, but he's a raw receiver, raw route runner. Didn't really face the press coverage he's going to face in the NFL. That's why his transition to the NFL is murky. But if there's any coach that I trust because he has the offensive creativity to scheme open a talent like Jalen Hyatt and create space for him, that's Brian Daboll. I wanted Hyatt to land in New York just to increase his chances of being a star in the NFL, and that's exactly what happened. So kudos to the Giants for having the risky move of going into the draft with 3 glaring needs, but doing a pretty good job of picking them in the right spot with these 3 players. And One more pick I liked was Eric Gray, the running back from Oklahoma. His tape was fun to watch, and I think he can be a splashy change of pace back.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Giants are another team that had a really underrated their draft. They're not really talked about among some of the top teams from what I've heard, but I think when you get really good value at your top 3 picks and they fill positions of need, that's worthy of a really good draft grade for them. And then the Dallas Cowboys at 26, they picked defensive tackle Mozzie Smith from Michigan. In the second round, they picked Luke Schoonmaker, the tight end from Michigan. Round 3, DeMarvin Overshawn, linebacker from Texas. Round 4, Viliami Fehoko Jr., defensive end from San Jose State. In round 5, Asim Richards, offensive tackle from North Carolina. To me, the Mozzie Smith pick in round 1 was, a little bit of a desperation pick. I think, and we all think they were going to be taking Dalton Kincaid or one of the tight ends at 26. And when the Bills jumped them to take Kincaid, I think they kind of got worried and we don't know what to do. And if I were them, I would have taken Michael Mayer. He was a top 10 player on my board, my top tight end in the draft. It doesn't seem like NFL teams felt the same way. But I just think Mozzie Smith, was a fair value, a little bit of a reach, but to fill a need at tight end, I think Mayer would have been a much better pick. Schoonmaker, to me, again, felt like a desperation pick. They need a tight end. There had been a run on tight ends already, and they needed to reach on Schoonmaker to fill that tight end need because they got worried. So I felt like they got caught up in the draft a little bit, almost playing catch up, and maybe weren't as prepared as I would have liked to seen them been if the board didn't fall their way, which it doesn't seem like it did.
Yeah, I don't know if they were not prepared, but they still ended up in situations where I think that they had someone that they wanted who went off the board shortly before them, like with Dalton Kincaid in round 1, and they didn't recover that well. Smith I think can be a good player. I just didn't see a first round talent, and I think Luke Schoonmaker was picked a round earlier than he should have been. I would have preferred Darnell Washington or Tucker Kraft there. And actually going back to the first round pick, it seems like it wasn't even between Mozzie Smith and Mayer. They actually released a video on social media of them debating on the clock whether or not they should be picking Mozzie Smith or Matthew Bergeron. And on your note about preparation, I feel like maybe that was already decided heading into the draft because there wasn't much conversation. It was just one of their scouts just talking out the decision. I think that was just because they knew there was going to be that social media clip, and
it was a weird video. It was a weird video that they released.
I doubt that that's actually what was happening in real time. They have those conversations beforehand and they prepare for every scenario. So I wouldn't just assume that it was lack of preparation. But regardless, I'm not too big of a fan of the Cowboys' draft class. And now moving on to the Bears. They started off the draft with a pick I just cannot get on board with at all. Maybe the worst pick of the first round, and that's Darnell Wright, the tackle from Tennessee. Then they went Gervon Dexter in round 2, Tyreek Stevenson in round 2 as well, Zach Pickens in round 3, Roschon Johnson in round 4, and they made a couple solid picks after that with Tyler Scott, the wide receiver from Cincinnati, Noah Sewell, the linebacker from Oregon. And I love the Roschon Johnson pick. I think he could end up being their starter. But just circling back to earlier in the draft, Darnell Wright, I didn't think had the best tape of the tackles that were still available. For Pierre Skronsky, I think, had better tape. Anton Harrison as well. And then he comes with serious character concerns, just questions about his maturity and especially his work ethic and commitment to football. I thought that there were a couple too many guys with those issues in this draft. Tyreek Stevenson is also rumored to have some character concerns. So for a team that doesn't have a winning culture, like let's say the Chiefs, who can afford to take gambles on character concerns, I just didn't love seeing 2 of their first 3 picks fall under that category. And then with Gervon Dexter and Zach Pickens, those are 2 really talented guys, but they're 5-star prospects that couldn't live up to the traits that they possess, which isn't usually a good trajectory for entering the NFL and having success.
Yeah, and to talk about what the Bears did in the first round a little bit more, obviously they started off at first overall, and then they obviously moved down to 9 and moved down to 10, and they added a first round pick next year and wide receiver DJ Moore. I don't think that's in totality a really good haul. If you move from 1 to eventually 10 and basically you net a first round pick next year, DJ Moore and Darnell Wright, I think look what the Cardinals did. They moved down from 3 to 6, netted a first round pick, and got the top tackle on their board. And then, a guy like excuse me, a guy like Jonathan Mingo could have been there for the taking in round 2, who could, potentially be a wide receiver 1. The Panthers took him, obviously, to replace DJ Moore. So I just don't think the Bears really got good value out of that first round pick. It seemed like they were a little bit rushed to trade out because they just wanted to get it done. I think they could have gotten more picks and, taken a better tackle in round 1 when they had their options completely open besides Paris Johnson.
Yeah, and not only that it just wasn't good value overall to start at 1 and end up with Darnell Wright at 10. But if you're going to pick a player that has severe character concerns, why aren't you sticking at 9 and taking the much superior talent in Jalen Carter? I know it's a different position, but if you're going to go down that route, you got to take Jalen Carter there.
Yeah, that's a great point too. And they obviously saw defensive tackle as a need because they took Dexter in round 2. So yeah, just the more you think about it, the more confusing this Bears draft was. Moving on to another confusing draft in the NFC North, the Detroit Lions, who moved from 6 to 12 to take Jahmyr Gibbs, the running back from Alabama, in their first round pick. At 18, their other first round pick, they took Jack Campbell, the linebacker from Iowa. The top of round 3, they took Sam Laporta, the tight end from Iowa. A second round pick, they took Brian Branch from Alabama. And then in the third round, they took Hendon Hooker from Tennessee. So just the Lions, to me, just really, really confusing. Gibbs seemed like a really big reach, both just talent-wise and position-wise. Jack Campbell also felt like a reach. Sam Laporta, to me, felt like a reach with other better tight ends available. I thought Brian Branch was a fine pick at 45, but nothing to get super excited about. I like the Hendon Hooker pick in round 3. I think he could develop and potentially be the quarterback of the future. But also taking him in round 3 doesn't guarantee that they feel the same way about him. But just really, really confusing from the Lions.
Yeah, I think that they got pretty unlucky with Seattle picking Witherspoon rather unexpectedly, because I think their plan was to go Witherspoon at 6 and then trade up from 18 for Jahmyr Gibbs, and that would have ended up being a better draft haul in my opinion. But their draft is kind of tough to evaluate for me because I don't want to bash it too much, even though each pick was not fantastic value. I think they're going to get 4 starters out of this draft, which means if that's the case, you didn't have a bad draft. But I just didn't love a couple of those values, especially in the first round, like you explained. And let's move on to the Green Bay Packers, who in the first round, they made a pretty Packers pick, who they're going to get a guy with top end traits in Lucas Van Ness, a little bit early in my liking, but I really like that after that on day 2, they turned the focus of the draft to building up the offensive skill positions for Jordan Love, because they've got a big question mark on Love, and this team's success depends on his ability to become their franchise quarterback. And I liked that they went with 2 tight ends on day 2, Luke Musgrave and Tucker Kraft. I think they complement each other really well. Tucker Kraft is a really good blocker who I think you can develop his receiving ability, but he won't be needed to do that much of it early on because Luke Musgrave is a really good receiver and a downfield threat, really athletic, who can stretch the field vertically as a tight end, which is impressive. And then Jaden Reed is maybe a pick that I'm a bit higher on than you. I had a late second round pick on him. And some people were really surprised to see his name go off the board that early. And although, because I had a late second round grade on him and they picked him 50th, it's a slight reach, but he's a solid player. And he's a well-rounded receiver who I think would have performed a lot better had he had better quarterback play at Michigan State. So I don't dislike that pick as much as some Packers fans do. One last thing about the Packers draft, Sean Clifford shouldn't have been drafted. He just shouldn't. if you take a look, for example, at Jahan Dotson's film, it was so frustrating because he was consistently open and Sean Clifford was missing him. So I don't think he should have been drafted. And I was pretty surprised to see him get picked.
Yeah, I really agree with you. I like what the Packers did with supporting Jordan Love. I think that we weren't sure if they would do that just because they didn't do that with Aaron Rodgers, but that's something that they needed to do. And I like that they took some tight ends who are, in ways more reliable targets because they're bigger bodied, not always running super far down the field, those 5, 10, 15-yard routes that, could be almost safety nets for Jordan Love. So I like what the Packers did, kind of all around. But yeah, besides that Clifford pick in round 5.
Yeah. Now, last but not least, the Minnesota Vikings. Their draft was light on draft capital because they were lacking a second-round pick, but I thought they had a good draft overall with what they had. I liked the Jordan Addison pick. He was my wide receiver too. They got him as the 4th receiver, and Justin Jefferson is a star, but that offense gets more dangerous when there's a second guy who brings dynamic route running to the table, and that's what Addison does. Adam Thielen left, and they really replace him to continue their ability to have 2 guys that are really dangerous at the receiver position. They needed cornerback help. I'm not sure if Blackman and Ward would have been the guys I would have picked, but they addressed that need with multiple picks, so that was good to see. And then I thought they made a few more good picks after that. Jacqueline Roy in round 5 was terrific value. I think he brings starter potential to the table. Jaron Hall was a nice pick. I like the traits that he possesses. He's got good upside to be a solid backup at the worst potentially. And then Dwayne McBride in the 7th round was an intriguing pick. I've heard that there's some character concerns that could have contributed to his fall in the draft, but if you just look at his running ability, I know he doesn't bring that much passing ability. He actually had more career fumbles than catches because they were just never asked him to catch the ball at UAB, but he was a really good runner. And I think he has starter level talent just as a pure runner. That being said, I don't expect him to become the starter. I mean, he's a 7th round pick. There's some character stuff, and he doesn't do much as a receiver, but I think he's going to carve out a role as a change of pace, depth piece in their rotation.
Yeah, I also think the Vikings had a solid draft. I think Addison kind of headlines it, especially without that 2nd round pick. And I think this was probably one of the best spots for him to be alongside one of the best receivers in the NFL, who's probably going to have to be double teamed. So Addison will not get as much attention from the defense as he would on most other teams. And I think that's really going to open up the game for him. And I think, I wouldn't be shocked if he ends up being the 1st or 2nd best receiver, or have the 1st or 2nd best rookie year out of this receiving class just because of his situation.
Yeah.
So that wraps up the NFC side of the draft grades. Any overarching themes that you kind of saw as we were going through these, or maybe your favorite draft class in the NFC?
First, I'll go with the themes. The theme was picking for need. And we saw several teams do it. Ideally, you would love to just be able to take best player available, but you know that you have to win now in most cases. Even though in 3-4 years, the better strategy is to pick the best players, because eventually guys are going to walk in free agency. For example, spots are going to open up if you have capable backups to replace them, but teams know they have holes and they need to address them to be able to win. We saw several teams just go and pick for need, and that's just what we have to understand is the reality of the NFL draft. One of my favorite draft classes, I mean, the obvious answer is the Eagles. But other than that, I'll say it again. The Rams had a really underrated draft, and I really liked what the Cardinals did with the capital they acquired next year. And I'll love to follow what their pick and the Texans pick will look like a year from now.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that the Eagles definitely, for me, possibly the best draft overall. But I agree with you. I love what the Cardinals did. I'm a huge fan of getting draft capital for next year while also taking your best player available or your number 1 target. That's exactly what the Cardinals did. And, like you mentioned, that pick could be very high next year and could set them up for either a quarterback opportunity or the opportunity to get a treasure chest of picks if, Kyler Murray balls out and they have a top 2 or 3 pick.
Yeah, it would be a treasure chest indeed.
So that wraps up our discussion on the NFC side. We'll be back with the AFC side soon, so be sure to check for that. And if you want to see all our draft grades, those are being posted on our Instagram page, Bold Take Scouting. So thanks everyone for watching. Thanks for sticking around this entire draft process, and we'll be back with another episode soon.